Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this beautiful Irish scene. It's a loose watercolour painting. I started the painting using the wet in wet technique and continued it with the wet on dry. This is the photograph that I took inspiration from. I shall leave a link in the description below to the Pixabay reference photograph. As you can see, I haven't been a slave to the photograph. I've simply used it for inspiration and as a starting point. And as always, I'm going to simplify the photograph by just sketching out the main details and putting in place very loosely the mountains, the lake and the shapes for the foreground. And that's just about all I need, just making sure I have a roadmap to follow when I come to paint. And here's the finished sketch. Just before the demo, I'd like to share with you that my book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner, is now available to purchase from all good bookstores. There are a couple of Amazon links below, one for the UK and one for US. So today I'm painting on Milford cold press watercolour paper. It's taped to my board and my board's at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees. And starting using the wet on wet technique, I'm going to just wet the sky in patches, leaving some dry patches for my clouds. Then the paint that I put on will flow into and diffuse into the damp areas and resist the dry areas, and I can blend the two together as I work the sky in. I shall try to keep it a little darker blue at the top and paler down towards the horizon. The brush I'm using is a Princeton Aqua Elite 1.5 inch Mottler brush, but use any wash brush that you're happy using, and I shall bring that same sky colour down into the lake. I'm now going to leave my sky alone and let it dry completely, and I'm going to put in the foreground. I'm using sap green. I have made it a little bit more earthy by adding some burnt sienna into it, not too much, because I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna a bit later once I've got most of this earthy green across the foreground. I'm following my initial sketch, keeping the marks sort of fairly loose, mostly using the tips and the corner of the brush this time, and putting in my marks on a slight diagonal so that I get the kind of impression of the grasses leaning over from the bottom of the tape on the foreground up towards the right. And then just putting in a small tree on the right where I'd drawn it, then adding in a little more of the burnt sienna just to bring some lovely golden warmth and tones into that area. and I can darken it up by adding a little bit of Payne's grey to my green mixture and put in some shadows in the canopies of the trees as well. And this is now a very light value of sap green with a touch of burnt sienna, but it's been greyed down or blued up a little with some cobalt blue. I'm just mapping out my distant mountains. This will give me a base layer, and I'll put in some texture and shadows a little bit later. But I want to keep it nice and pale because paler colours recede, and I want to get the impression of depth and distance here. Everything will gently soften and diffuse into the sky. So I'm making sure that my paint mixture isn't too wet. If my mixture was too wet, I'd get some cauliflower marks. So before I paint my paint on, I'm just touching my brush onto a paper towel to absorb any excess moisture. Then I can pull out a bit of the paint using a damp round brush, just to lighten that back even further, just to keep it nice and pale so that I get that sense of recession. Just before I leave it to dry, I'm going to use my palette knife and create a few highlights across the foreground. I'm starting with the midground tree, putting in some trunks and branches, scraping through the damp paint to reveal the white of the paper below, and then scraping through the damp paint in the foreground to create these lovely curved pale grasses, just adding to the texture and the impression of something and nothing in the foreground. I can put some shadows around them a little bit later. So that's my first layer done. I now need to leave it all to dry completely. Everything's nice and dry. I can now continue with the painting, this time using the wet on dry method. The first thing I'm going to do is add some shadows to my mountains, but I don't want my shadow colour to be really dark. It has to be pale so that I keep that sense of recession. So I've mixed up a grey using cobalt blue, burnt sienna and a touch of alizarin crimson, and it's a very light value, and I'm consulting the reference photograph and making sure I get my shadows in about the right sort of position to create an illusion of depth and distance, and also an illusion of various features like forests and rocky outcrops and things like that across those distant mountains. This is my size 14 Escoda Perla. It's a really nice round brush with a good tip, and it's perfect for painting areas like this. And hopefully you can see how the depth and distance is building up, keeping it nice and dark just at the edge of the mountains and the lake, and then coming over to this other side and continuing to build up the illusion of these distant mountains. I'm now adding some value to the foreground, and for this I'm using a small calligraphy brush, but any small round brush with a good point will do, and this is a darker green mixed from my sap green, burnt sienna and a bit of Payne's grey, and I'm working it between the marks that I painted in earlier and those that I scraped in with the palette knife. Just creating some shadows and still leaving, sort of negatively painting around some of the grasses so that I get those nice light grasses in the very foreground. I'm being careful not to overdo this, just enough shadow in the foreground to bring that loose detail together and sort of crystallise that illusion of grasses. And then I can move over and add a little bit of value, dark tone to the tree. Some darker trunks, keeping my paler highlights and then just adding in a few branches. You can do this with a rigger brush, but I'm carrying on using my calligraphy brush because I don't need to make many marks here. It's just bringing again that detail together so that the loose marks I made in the first layer now become a little bit more definite. And to finish off the painting, I'm just going to put in the middle distance using a mid value of green, sap green, a bit of Payne's grey, some burnt sienna again, following my sketch to bring in these slightly sort of closer headlands that stick out of this side of the lake. If the colour looks like it's drying back a bit too dark, I can dab a bit of that out with a tissue. But I want to use brighter, warmer colour so that these pieces of land come forward from the distant mountains, again giving us depth and distance. And I think that's just about done for this simple beginner-friendly and intermediate-friendly loose watercolour painting. I'm not going to go any further because I would then be in danger of adding too much detail. The idea is to try and keep it as loose and as fresh with as fewer brushstrokes as possible, really, so that we can really exploit the transparent beauty of watercolour to its fullest. I've removed the tape and hopefully you can see now that I've got a better light on the photograph with its clean white border, that it comes together quite nicely. I think we do have a reasonably good sense of recession and depth and distance, And I think the sky works quite nicely, considering it's just one colour, cobalt blue, and just working carefully to preserve the white of the paper in places, but to vary the tone of blue to keep it looking quite grey for these fresh cloud shadows in places. I hope you found that helpful and that you'll try something similar yourself, and that some of these methods that I've demonstrated here will prove to be good transferable skills that you can pick up and put your own spin on in your own paintings. If you enjoyed the painting, then please click on the thumbs up button and leave us a comment. I'll be interested to hear what you think of this painting. And many thanks to everybody that supported us on Patreon. If you'd like to support the channel on Patreon, please follow the links below. So that's it from me for today. I'm off to my studio to continue working on some of my own projects. So until next time, take good care of yourselves, and I'll see you again soon. And happy painting. Bye.